Meituan's research team completed a training run for a frontier-class language model without a single H100 in the stack, hardware that OpenAI and Google treat as the minimum entry fee for this tier of development, and the resulting model, LongCat, landed benchmark scores that independent testers placed within the same competitive tier as systems that burn through clusters most national governments couldn't license. That happened not over a decade of incremental progress, but across what looks like a single product generation of adaptation. The question this race is really asking is not whether China has caught up on a scorecard. The question is whether Nvidia's export controls are still a wall, or whether they have become a treadmill, and whether the Western frontier can widen the gap faster than Chinese labs learn to ignore it. The contest runs leg by leg, and the split time at each leg will tell you whether the distance is holding. Here is the pace thesis before the legs start. A breakthrough in artificial intelligence is not a new number on a leaderboard. It is a change in clock speed. The story is not that LongCat exists. It is that the interval between restricted from the hardware and competitive on the output just compressed by what looks like a full product generation. That compression rate is the race, and the race starts with benchmarks. On standard evaluations for reasoning, language, and coding, the Western frontier currently defines the ceiling. OpenAI's flagship systems and Google's most capable models set that ceiling by training on clusters running tens of thousands of H100 accelerators, with Nvidia providing not just raw throughput, but an entire software ecosystem. 2 decades of accumulated compiler tooling, optimized libraries, and a developer base that knows how to extract near-theoretical performance from the silicon. The gap between their benchmark scores and the next tier of models on the hardest multi-step reasoning tasks available before mid-2025 is measurable, and on those hardest tasks, substantial. This is not a contested point. The Western frontier clock has been running longer, on better hardware, with better tooling, and the scoreboard reflects that. LongCat's published results, partially corroborated by third-party testers who ran standard suite evaluations, place the model within competitive range on general language tasks and a subset of coding benchmarks. Reports suggest it trails on the hardest multi-step reasoning categories, where the Western frontier still holds a clear interval. No independent benchmark has yet fully replicated Meituan's own reported scores across all categories, so the exact width of the gap carries uncertainty. But the existence of competitive performance on a restricted hardware stack is the data point that anchors this leg. A model produced without the minimum hardware entry fee for this tier is producing outputs that belong in this tier on most of what the evaluations measure. My read, and I'll hold it to scrutiny across the remaining legs, is that the efficiency story behind LongCat is being systematically underweighted by Western analysts because it looks like a workaround rather than a capability. But a workaround that closes a benchmark gap by half in one product cycle is a capability. The distinction is semantic, and treating it as minor is how you misread a split. Western frontier clock. Benchmark ceiling set over multiple training generations on unconstrained compute, a multi-year runway of iteration. LongCat's clock. Competitive on general tasks, trailing on the hardest reasoning, the gap by available third-party reads roughly 1 to 2 capability tiers, not a full generation. The lead exists, and the rate of change is the next leg. Here is where the training run itself becomes the object to follow. Meituan's engineers, working without H100 access, had to solve problems that Western engineers have not had to touch in years. Suboptimal interconnect bandwidth between chips, a software stack with shallower tooling, and hardware that delivers a fraction of the H100's memory bandwidth per unit. Their response was algorithmic, techniques including aggressive quantization, reducing the numerical precision of computations to lower memory pressure without proportionally reducing output quality, modified attention mechanisms that compress what the model needs to hold in working memory at any given moment, and training curriculum adjustments that extract more signal per compute cycle. The company's own claims credit these methods with closing a significant fraction of the raw hardware gap. Independent confirmation is partial. The benchmark outputs exist and are measurable. Think of it as 2 runners on a track where one has a purpose-built racing flat and the other is wearing a training shoe. The racing flat is genuinely faster. The biomechanics are optimized at the factory. But if the runner in the training shoe rewrites their stride mechanics, shortens ground contact time, and generates the same ground force through technique, the shoe gap stops compounding the way the manufacturer's spec sheet predicted. The hardware delta is real. The question is whether technique can systematically close it, and for how long before the runner hits a wall that technique cannot climb. Nvidia's advantage is not just peak floating point operations. It is the density of the ecosystem around the hardware. The CUDA software layer is less like a piece of software and more like a road network paved over 20 years. Now, with rest stops, traffic signals, and a generation of engineers who have never navigated without it. An engineer trained on that stack moves faster than an equally talented engineer starting from scratch on a different system, independent of which system is theoretically superior. That institutional compounding is what the efficiency gap in this leg is really measuring. Western frontier clock on efficiency, high throughput per chip, high throughput per engineer hour, the compounding advantage of a mature stack. LongCat's clock, lower per chip throughput, partially compensated by algorithmic efficiency. Reports suggest the effective compute gap, adjusted for technique, is meaningfully narrower than the hardware specification sheet implies. The split that was a full product generation in leg 1 is beginning to look more like a single model cycle here. The lead is compressing, and the third leg is where the physical infrastructure of that compression becomes visible. The hardware the LongCat run reportedly used, at least in part, is Huawei's Ascend 910B and its successors, the domestic accelerator line that China has been building as a substitute for Nvidia compute. The Ascend chips are manufactured on nodes that are not at the leading edge by global standards. Reports indicate production on the most advanced process available from SMIC, China's leading domestic chipmaker, which lags TSMC's leading node by what analysts estimate as at least 1 to 2 generations. That lag matters. At chip scale, the gap between a leading-edge node and a trailing one translates directly into how many operations per watt you can extract, and into the transistor density that determines how much you can fit on a die. To make that physical, if you printed every transistor in an H100 as a single dot on a piece of paper, the page would be roughly the size of a tennis court. The gap between that count and the comparable Ascend chip's transistor count at the same dot scale is not a few rows at the edge, it is a portion of the court. That distance at actual chip scale is the power efficiency delta that algorithmic optimization is trying to close. The H100 contains roughly 80 billion transistors on a die smaller than a playing card. The manufacturing precision required to build that chip depends on ASML's extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, which China does not currently have access to for leading-edge production. This is the supply chain variable that makes the independence leg genuinely complicated. Here is my hypothesis, introduced here and tested in the brake leg. The export control regime is functioning exactly as intended at the frontier, keeping China off the absolute top rung, while simultaneously accelerating the domestic hardware ecosystem faster than any subsidy program alone would have. If that is true, the controls are buying time, not distance. The LongCat training run is the evidence for the second half of that claim. The existence of a functional run on a domestic stack, one that produced a competitive model, is a capability milestone independent of how the chip compares on a specification sheet. China's independence clock has moved from not credible to operational with limits. Picture two relay teams where one carries a baton, machined to exact tolerances. It transfers perfectly, adds no drag, the handoff is frictionless. The other team carved their baton from a different material, slightly heavier. The grip is not quite right, but it is theirs. They control the supply. The first team runs faster right now, but if the baton supplier stops shipping or prices the perfect baton beyond reach, the question of who holds the race changes character entirely. Western compute independence clock, full stack control of the software layer, heavy dependence on TSMC and ASML for hardware, geographic concentration that is real but not yet acute, China's independence clock, domestic accelerators, operational for training, runs at competitive model scale, manufacturing node lagging, by analyst estimates of 1 to 2 generations. The gap on hardware independence has narrowed from entirely absent to present but constrained. The lead on this leg is smaller than either side's public statements suggest. Now, the break. The efficiency story in the previous legs is real enough to make the compression look smooth all the way to the frontier. LongCat's general benchmark performance, the training on Ascend proof of concept, the algorithmic innovations, read together, they suggest a trajectory that arrives at the very top of the capability stack within a model cycle or two. If you take each split at face value and project linearly, China's clock is running fast enough to close this too. But the tasks where the Western frontier is genuinely hardest to reach are the ones where raw compute throughput cannot be substituted by a clever training curriculum. Long context reasoning, holding a 100,000 token window coherently, chaining multiple inference steps without the output degrading, scales with memory bandwidth in ways that technique addresses only partially. Multimodal training, video understanding, high-resolution image reasoning, requires data movement between compute and memory at rates where the hardware gap between an H100 and an Ascend 910B becomes a ceiling, not a constraint to route around. Reports from independent evaluators consistently show the Western frontier models maintaining their largest advantage precisely on these tasks. The honest read is that the gap here is not compressing at the same rate as the earlier legs. It may be widening at the very top. At the very top of the reasoning frontier, the hardware gap stops being a coefficient and starts being a wall. Think of it as a swimmer doing open water distance. Technique and conditioning carry you a long way when the water is calm. But past a certain point, the current is strong enough that you are swimming to stay in place. The algorithmic techniques that close the gap in flat water do not generate more thrust in the channel. This is where I invoke my own pushback on the read I have been building. The efficiency plateau hypothesis. The algorithmic gains tracked in the earlier legs may be subject to diminishing returns. If you can close 40% of the hardware gap with technique, but the last 60% is physics, memory bandwidth limits, interconnect latency, transistor density, then the break is not just a temporary feature of this race. It is a structural one. I do not have enough data to call that confidently. The evidence runs thin here in a way I want to be explicit about. What I can call is this. The frontier's top rung is the one place where the Western clock is still pulling away, not holding steady. The export controls are working at the frontier and losing ground everywhere below it. Both things are true simultaneously, and neither the mirage reading nor the permanent lead reading survives contact with all the available evidence. 12 months out, flagged as projection, not established fact, the most plausible read is this. The general capability benchmark gap between LongCat tier Chinese models and the Western frontier continues to compress, with additional efficiency-optimized training runs on Ascend-class hardware producing models that close to within one competitive tier on standard evaluations. The reasoning and multimodal frontier gap holds or widens modestly as the Western lab's next training generation, still on unconstrained H100 and successor hardware, AFES extends the lead on exactly the tasks where raw throughput is hardest to replace. The domestic hardware track, Huawei's Ascend roadmap, and SMIC's manufacturing progress remains the variable with the widest uncertainty range. If Ascend's next generation arrives on a meaningfully improved process node, the independence clock accelerates faster than this projection. If manufacturing yield or process maturity lags, the hardware ceiling stays where it is, and the algorithmic optimization story hits the physics wall sooner. My plain call: the export controls have done what they were designed to do at the frontier's top rung, and less than they were designed to do everywhere below it. The interesting race is not whether China reaches the capability tier that the Western frontier occupied 12 months ago. Available evidence suggests that is already a matter of when measured in months, not whether. The interesting race is whether the frontier itself is moving fast enough to stay out of reach. Right now, it is. In 12 months, that answer is less certain than it looks today. A benchmark score is a split time at the halfway mark. A spectator sees the gap. An analyst reads the rate of change. A half-second gap that was 2 seconds 3 laps ago is a different race than a half-second gap that was half a second 3 laps ago. That is where LongCat's benchmark position sits. The gap exists, but the closure rate is the data that matters. 2 clocks have been running in this race. One has better hardware. The other just learned to read time differently. And the distance between those two statements is closing faster than the scoreboards show. Here is what I am watching for in the next model cycle. Does the efficiency playbook, the algorithmic rewrites, the training curriculum, the quantization stack, transfer to the reasoning frontier, or does it hit the physics wall described in the brake leg? Which clock runs out of room first? Nvidia's export ceiling or China's hardware ceiling? Drop your read in the comments. If you want to track how this split changes when the next Ascend generation ships, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because that is when this race gets genuinely hard to call.